What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Hope that you're all having a great week so far, and really appreciate you tuning in to today's episode. We are getting closer and closer to the 2024 season, and I mentioned in the last episode that from here on out, I wanted to focus mainly on previewing a lot of the teams, schedules, matchups, and everything that the 2024 season might hold, and hopefully give a little bit of insight on some of the programs that I think could have a major impact this fall. So over the coming weeks, I wanted to go through a lot of the teams that I've realized I might be higher on or believe in the potential of more than most of the public. So let's get right into it. One of the teams that I think my perception of differs from the general consensus the most is Florida. And today I wanted to preview the Florida Gators, their schedule, their roster, some of their key playmakers, and why I believe they might see more success in 2024 than most people may think. Billy Napier and Florida are coming off back-to-back losing seasons and have a projected win total of just 4.5 games heading into this fall. They went 6-7 in 2022 and 5-7 last year, and Vegas and the sports books project that they're likely to land right around that record again in 2024. But there's a few major reasons that I think the Gators can exceed that win total and not just go over 4.5 at 5 wins, but potentially 7, 8, or even 9 wins. First things first, let's go back to 2023 and recap the season that Florida had. They went 5-7 with wins over McNeese by 42. They beat number 11 Tennessee by 13. Beat Charlotte by 15, Vanderbilt by 24, and South Carolina by 2. Then their losses were to number 14 Utah by 13, Kentucky by 19, number 1 Georgia by 23, Arkansas by 3 in overtime, number 19 LSU by 17, number 9 Missouri by 2, and number 5 Florida State by 9. So they started the year 5-2, but then ended on a 5-game losing streak to end up missing a bowl game. So not ideal for Florida last season to miss the bowl and finish with an under 500 record again. This is the first time that Florida has had 3 consecutive losing seasons since 1945 to 1947. So needless to say, they're at a little bit of a low point right now, but I don't believe they're quite as bad as it might seem. Going back to 2023, there were several opportunities for the Gators to get that 6th win and potentially 7 or 8. Against Utah, I just went back and watched the highlights of that game, and the amount of self-inflicted mistakes Florida had was crazy. They gave up a 75-yard touchdown on the Utes' first play of the game, but then after that, the score was just 17-11 the rest of the way. They had a penalty in that game for having 2 players with the same number on the field during a punt return, which gave the ball back to Utah after the Gator defense had just forced a stop. The Utes took advantage of that, got good field position, and scored a touchdown 3 plays later. They had a pass go straight off a receiver's hands, batted up in the air twice, and then picked off at the 12-yard line. The Utes took advantage of that mistake and scored a touchdown 3 plays later again. They had an illegal formation penalty on a 3rd down that they converted, but the play got called back. The Gators then went for it on 4th down and got stopped, turning the ball over on downs, and that was at the Utah 15-yard line. They missed a 31-yard field goal and barely missed a touchdown near the end of the game on a pass that was overthrown by like a yard because Graham Mertz got hit right as he was releasing it. So they scheduled a very tough non-conference opponent on the road in week 1, and it was a game that they lost by 13, but that deficit was largely in part due to self-inflicted mistakes. And those mistakes continued against Arkansas, a game in which Florida lost by 3 in overtime, but could have won by 3 in regulation, but missed a critical field goal at the end of regulation. They had a field goal attempt from the Arkansas 26 and missed it with 3 seconds left. On the road against number 9 Missouri, the Gators lost by 2, 33-31, on a 30-yard field goal made by the Tigers' Harrison Mevis with 5 seconds left in the game. And in this game, the ESPN win probability chart gave Florida an 89.8% chance to win with 1:36 left. The Gators virtually had it won until they allowed Missouri to convert on 4th and 17 with 38 seconds left. 4th and 17, it was just insane. In this game, Florida also lost quarterback Graham Mertz for the season after he collided with 2 defenders at the same time. Mertz went out in the 4th quarter, and they didn't have him for their last 3 drives, on one of which backup quarterback Max Brown fumbled at the Missouri 15-yard line. And to end the season, the Gators lost to number 5 Florida State 24-15, despite leading 12-0 and entering the 4th quarter with a lead. The Gators also missed 2 field goals in that game as well. So tons of self-inflicted mistakes in game-changing penalties against Utah. They missed a field goal against Arkansas that would have won the game at the end of regulation. a 4th and 17 allowed conversion against Missouri that ultimately lost them the game. And they came very close to beating number 5 FSU at the end of the year in the battle of the backups there between Tate Rodemaker and Max Brown. But they blew out their FCS opponent. They beat number 11 Tennessee by 2 touchdowns and took care of business against some of the bottom SEC teams like Vanderbilt and South Carolina. But moving on to their upcoming 2024 schedule, which if you're on social media like at all, you've probably seen their schedule or at very least the last 5 games of it. So it's gotten a lot of attention over the past few months because it is the hardest schedule of any team in college football this year. If you're listening on podcast, their schedule consists of Miami, Samford, Texas A&M, at Mississippi State, hosting UCF, at Tennessee, hosting Kentucky, neutral site against Georgia, at Texas, hosting LSU, hosting Ole Miss, and then finishing at Florida State. And according to the ESPN FPI, which is the only full ranking system that we have right now before the preseason polls and stuff, it's the only one that's not just like an opinion top 25 basically by an analyst or something. But the FPI and ESPN system has the Gators playing 7 teams in the top 25 of the current FPI rankings. The last 5 teams that they play, their FPI rankings are number 1, number 3, number 13, number 16, and number 11, respectively. So here's my perspective on their schedule, though. Is it hard? Absolutely. It's the hardest of any team as of right now. But what I think most people haven't considered is how much the schedule can change. Not in terms of the teams themselves, obviously, but the perceived caliber of those teams. It happens all the time where schedules get harder throughout the season than they initially look because 1 or 2 teams that a lot of people weren't expecting to be that tough end up actually being pretty good. And that can certainly happen the other way, where a team that looks like a massive opponent for Florida might end up not being all that crazy. Texas, for example, the Gators go to Austin on November 9th, but before Texas plays Florida, the Longhorns play Michigan, Oklahoma, and Georgia throughout the year. So Texas could be a multiple loss team when Florida comes to town and might have some of that momentum gone or wind taken out of their sails from that college football playoff run that they had last season. LSU just lost the Heisman Trophy winner at quarterback and 2 first-round wide receivers and 3 starting defensive linemen to the draft. They also had 2 other high-caliber D linemen transfer out, 1 to Minnesota and 1 to Colorado. And I'm not saying that it won't, but what if things don't quite pan out for the Tigers and quarterback Garrett Nussmeier in trying to replace what they lost? The Gators also get LSU at home in the Swamp, which is a considerable factor. What about Ole Miss on November 23rd? The Rebels have had quite the offseason in terms of transfer portal acquisitions and recruiting. I think they've got one of the best, if not the best, transfer portal classes, and they look to take a jump this year and get a spot in that 12-team playoff. But over the past few years, their main struggles have almost always been on the road, and they have to go to the Swamp too, like LSU does. In 2021, for example, Ole Miss started the year strong. They got all the way up to number 10 and then immediately lost by 2 possessions on the road at Auburn. In 2022, again, the Rebels started really hot. They went 7-0 to start the year, got ranked all the way up at number 7 in the AP poll, then lost by 25 on the road to unranked LSU. In 2023, last year was a little bit different because of the opponents who they played, but their only 2 losses were on the road to Alabama by 14 and on the road to Georgia by 35. And the last time Ole Miss visited Florida, they lost by 28 back in 2015. So that could be one that the Gators could steal. The Rebels have struggled on the road, and who knows what could happen on that Saturday in November. And I feel like a lot of college football fans have looked at Florida's schedule, saw that it's extremely hard, saw the last 5 opponents, thought to themselves, yeah, they're going 4-8 or something like that, and haven't thought twice about it afterward. But if you really go game by game and also look at the roster that Florida has, not just that of who they play, there's a lot of potential for Florida to surprise some people this year. In April in the NFL draft, the Gators had just 1 player taken, and that was first-round wide receiver Ricky Pearsall, which isn't great for the Gators in terms of NFL draft pick count and NFL purposes, but it is a good thing for Florida in terms of how many players they return. In 2024, the Gators are 26th out of 134 teams in the FBS in returning production, with 68% returning. That's the same number as Georgia, Miami, Clemson, and Arizona. They bring back QB1 in Graham Mertz, who I believe had a very underrated season last year. He had 2,903 passing yards, 24 total touchdowns, and just 3 interceptions. And like I mentioned towards the beginning in that Utah game, one of those interceptions went directly off the hands of one of the receivers. So Mertz was one of the better quarterbacks in the country in terms of pass selection and safety with the ball. He finished third in the FBS and second in the Power 5 in completion percentage at 72.9%, behind only Heisman finalist Bo Nix. He also did all of that in just under 11 games. He played basically 10 games in like 3 quarters or so before his shoulder injury. This stat about Mertz is something that I noticed the other day and found really interesting, but he's been a starter in the Power 5 for 3 seasons, 2 with Wisconsin and 1 with Florida. In each of those seasons, year over year, he has thrown for more yards, more touchdowns, and less interceptions than the season before. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see on the screen, but if you're listening on podcast, in 2021 with Wisconsin, Mertz threw for 1,958 yards, 10 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. In 2022, he threw for 2,136 yards, 19 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. And then last season in 2023, Mertz threw for 2,903 yards, 20 touchdowns, and just the 3 interceptions. So in all 5 years that he's been a college football player, he has thrown for more yards and more touchdowns than the season before every single year, if you go back to his early days in 2019 and 2020 as well. So he could really be poised for a substantial season in 2024. And should Mertz happen to go down with an injury again, behind him the Gators have a 5-star and the number 1 player in Texas, the number 1 quarterback, and number 3 overall recruit in the class of 2024 in DJ Lagway, who I actually saw yesterday on a TV commercial for Gatorade, which is wild. He's not even the starter yet and already has a NIL deal with Gatorade due to the tie-in to Florida. But Lagway threw for 2 touchdowns in their spring game, and for example, in a situation like last season against Florida State, after Mertz got hurt against Missouri, Lagway is a seriously good weapon to have as a backup. The Gators returned starting running back in Montrell Johnson. Johnson accounted for 1,053 total yards and 6 touchdowns last season. He's rushed for over 800 yards in all 3 seasons that he's played. They lost Trevor Etienne, who transferred to Georgia, but they get former Tulane transfer Cam Carroll back from injury. He missed all of last season after an injury, I think, in their spring game or spring practice. But they're also adding 2 4-star recruits in KD Daniels and Jaden Baugh to the running back room as well. At wide receiver, they lost Ricky Pearsall to the NFL, but they returned wide receivers 2, 3, 4, and 5 in terms of number of receiving yards in Eugene Wilson, tight end Arliss Boardingham, Khalil Jackson, and Montrell Johnson, who they threw to a lot out of the backfield. Pearsall was the Gators' leader in receiving yards, but Eugene Wilson was actually their leader in receiving touchdowns. And he's a player who could really have a breakout season and make his way into the national conversation this fall. According to Pro Football Focus, PFF, Wilson has the number 1 drop grade of any returning receiver in college football. Drop grade meaning in terms of how few times he drops a pass. Now here's where things get interesting for Florida, in my opinion. In the transfer portal, they landed Arizona State's Elijah Badger, who accounted for 1,579 yards and 11 total touchdowns in 2 years, with the Sun Devils averaging 11.7 yards per catch. Last time the Gators landed a transfer from Arizona State, he happened to go in the first round. Pearsall came from Arizona State a few years back, but they also landed Wisconsin wide receiver Chimere Dike, who played with Graham Mertz for 3 years in 2020, 2021, and 2022. In his time with the Badgers, Dike caught 97 passes for 1,478 yards and 10 total touchdowns, averaging 15.2 yards per catch. What's odd is that I think it was around this time last year, maybe a little later in July or August or something, but I thought Mertz was an underrated quarterback heading into last season, and I remember going through a lot of his highlights at Wisconsin and noticing that play after play after play, Mertz's highlight passes were largely thrown to DK. And I put together this post on Twitter and Instagram about some recent transfer quarterbacks that had success at their second school and after rough starts to their career, and I thought that Mertz could definitely be one of those guys after transferring to Florida. But I remember thinking while watching Mertz's highlights, well, Florida might as well get this DK guy too if they're going to take Mertz from the portal, because every pass I'm seeing is to DK, and now they did get him. So that's a very under-the-radar piece of Florida's roster just from a talent perspective. I don't think many people really are aware of DK or what he can do. but most people really aren't aware that he's rejoining a quarterback who he already played with for 3 full seasons and the experience and chemistry that they'll have there. The Gators also got Tank Hawkins and TJ Abrams, 2 4-star wide receiver recruits in the class of 2024, and they get back Andy Jean, who is a 4-star in the class of 2023 that the Gators landed over Alabama, but he missed most of the season last year due to an injury and had just 6 receptions for 97 yards. He did average 16.2 yards per catch, though, on those limited receptions. So they basically add another 4-star wide receiver with getting Jean back healthy. At tight end, they return Arliss Boardingham, who had 26 receptions for 289 yards and 4 touchdowns last year, averaging 11.1 yards per catch. They landed 4-star tight end recruit Amir Jackson, the number 8 tight end in the 2024 class, and landed Air Force transfer Caleb Rios, who is 6'6", 255, for some depth. On the offensive line, they're adding 4-star transfer Jason Zandamela from USC. Zandamela was the number 7 overall player and number 1 offensive guard in the transfer portal cycle. He was the highest rated 4-star, so a borderline 5-star in 24/7's system. They also added Arkansas transfer Devin Manuel and San Diego State transfer Brandon Crenshaw-Dixon. Both are offensive tackles. They landed 4-star offensive tackle recruit Fletcher Westphal over Clemson, who is 6'8", 335, coming out of high school, which is wild. They also returned a lot of their offensive line from last season in Najee Harris, Jake Slaughter, Austin Barber, and Damian George. According to PFF, Crenshaw-Dixon, Manuel, and Barber are 3 of the top 10 highest-graded returning offensive tackles in the SEC, and Jake Slaughter is the 3rd highest-graded returning interior offensive lineman in the SEC as well. PFF ranks Florida as having the 10th best offensive line in college football heading into 2024. On defense, Florida lost edge Princely Umanmielen to Ole Miss in the portal, but they're bringing in 5-star defensive end LJ McCray, who is the number 1 defensive lineman, number 3 player in Florida, and number 4 overall recruit in the class of 2024. They also landed Penn transfer Joey Slackman, who is the 49th overall player and number 4 defensive lineman in this recent transfer cycle. PFF has Slackman as the highest graded returning defensive tackle in the SEC, and by a pretty significant margin over Kentucky's Deion Walker, who is a star in his own right. I think Slackman could be for Florida similar to what Braden Fisk was for Florida State last year after he transferred from Western Michigan. They're very similar in size, similar build, similar skill set, and transferring in from a smaller school after a couple years of experience. So Slackman could be a huge addition to that defensive line for the Gators this fall. At linebacker, the Gators brought in 4-star South Carolina transfer Grayson Howard and 2 4-star recruits in Aaron Childs and Miles Graham. Childs is the number 6 linebacker and number 2 player in Maryland, and Graham is the number 9 linebacker and a top 15 recruit in the state of Florida. They also returned Shamar James, who is really the crown jewel of that defense last year prior to getting injured right before the Georgia game. Over the past 2 years, James has 101 total tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks. In the secondary, they add Colorado transfer Cormani McClain, who as a recruit was a 5-star, the number 1 cornerback, number 4 player in Florida, and number 14 overall recruit in the class of 2023. He's from Lakeland, Florida, went out to Colorado for a year, I guess didn't like how things were going there, and is now back in his home state as part of the Gators. They also landed Jameer Grimsley, a 4-star transfer from Alabama. Additionally, they got Washington transfer Asa Turner and Oregon transfer Triquez Bridges, and they got 4-star safety recruit Gregory Smith III as well. Head coach Billy Napier is going into his 3rd full season as the head coach of the Gators. 3rd full season as a Power 5 head coach. He has a couple years to look back at now and learn from. He's a coach who led Louisiana to a 34-5 record over 3 seasons in 2019, 2020, and 2021. They went 13-1 in 2021. He led the Raging Cajuns to a top 15 finish in 2020, and I think Florida has the right guy at head coach. He's received a lot of scrutiny lately with the 2 sub-500 seasons, but I think they've got the right guy. It's just taking a little bit of time. So to wrap it up, the 2024 Florida Gators have much more potential than I think most college football fans in the general public know. I think they have a floor, a worst-case scenario record of maybe 3-9, but then on the flip side, I also think there's a world where they could end the regular season 8-4, or if things go really right for them, I think they could be 9-3. that's going to finish things up. I really appreciate you tuning in today, and I hope this episode was able to give you some insight into what I think could be one of the 2024 season's most interesting teams to keep an eye on. So make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, or follow wherever you're listening on podcast, and come back next time for some more college football content. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.